September 2014, after days of fighting, Houthi militia took control of the capital and several important government departments. But under the mediation of a UN special envoy, they signed a ceasefire deal with the government. However, their opinions varied on how a cabinet should be put together, as well as on military reform. On January 19, 2015, Houthi militants, unhappy with the slow progress, managed to infiltrate the presidential palace after a battle with security forces, and President Hadi and his ministers were imprisoned. The Houthis declared themselves in full control on February 6th. They dissolved Parliament and the government and installed a revolutionary committee instead. 2 weeks later, Hadi escaped to Aden in South Yemen and resumed his presidency there. But in March, Houthi militia attacked Aden, and Hadi and his cabinet had to flee to Saudi Arabia. As a pro-government coalition, Saudi Arabia and its allies have been bombing the Houthi militias ever since. The chaotic situation on the Arabian Peninsula left a vacuum for the Islamic State militant group and Al-Qaeda as they carried out a series of terror attacks. International mediation didn't help. In June, related parties met in Geneva for a first round of peace talks, but they came nowhere near finding a consensus. The Saudi Arabia-led coalition retook the city of Aden in July before recovering 5 more provinces in southern Yemen. In what seemed a more secure environment, Hadi returned to Aden in September, but a terror attack on his office meant he went back to Saudi Arabia. He stayed there until November, before he, once again, came back to Aden and started directing operations against the Houthis from there. In December, a new round of peace talks started in Switzerland, from which a temporary ceasefire deal took effect. But 5 days later, a UN envoy announced the cessation of the talks, as the ceasefire deal was violated. But the will was there to end the fighting, and last month the coalition confirmed that its troops and the Houthis would observe a ceasefire in the Saudi-Yemen border regions. Saudi Arabia also announced a reduction in the scale of their military operations. Rory Cohn, CCTV.
Let's get more insights and analysis on what the conflict and the proposed ceasefire in Yemen portends, especially for Africa and the region. We're joined by CCTV's Yasser Hakim. He's live for us in Cairo. Clementine Logan is live in Djibouti. Yasser, let's begin with you. Egypt is part of the Saudi-led coalition, which also draws in several African countries fighting the Houthi rebels in Yemen. The ceasefire also coincides with the Saudi monarch's visit to Cairo. So, how is this ceasefire and its implementation being viewed by the Egyptian and Saudi authorities there?
Yes, both leaders, the Egyptian president and the Saudi king, have discussed Yemen during their meeting here in Cairo. And if you talk about the official response, well, they wait to see what will come out of the meetings, a round of meetings in Kuwait. It might be successful, but if you talk on the general level, there's not much optimism. It's not the first ceasefire that has not taken effect for long. It's number 4, I believe, and it's been very fragile ceasefire. Already early in the day, or a few hours before the ceasefire, 40 people were killed in fighting in 2 separate areas, one in northern Sana'a and another in Al-Bayda city. So it's still a very hot situation, and many believe it will not, the ceasefire might not last for long.
Well, Clem, coming to you, Djibouti has witnessed an influx of Yemeni refugees through the course of this conflict there. Why is this the case, and what conditions do they face when they get there?
Well, Panina Markazi refugee camp is located in Obok in northern Djibouti. It's a very hot, dry and unforgiving landscape, but now it's home to over 6,700 Yemeni refugees. And the reason for that influx is its proximity to Yemen, 30 miles across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. That's around a 12-hour boat journey if you're in a reliable boat, although many of the refugees told us it took them a lot longer. Now, the camp's numbers are comparatively small, but managers tell us their needs are great. There's a high level of severe acute malnutrition among the children who've arrived. Many children and adults suffering from psychological disorders after the trauma they experienced as they fled the fighting in Yemen as well. A lot of them complained to us that there simply wasn't enough food or water and nothing to do inside the camp, with few job opportunities outside it in an area of Djibouti with the lowest employment level. So this camp is a strain on already limited resources. Earlier on we met with some of the refugees and those managing the camp, and this is their story. Mane Abdulrahman Saleh, his wife and 3 children have lived in Markazi refugee camp for almost a year now. They fled fighting between Houthi rebels and the Saudi-backed government. Relentless airstrikes forced them to risk the journey in an overcrowded boat to the rocky shores of Obok in northern Djibouti.
The war was very intense. There were airstrikes coming from every direction. We lived in a second-floor apartment and we were so afraid for our children. We used to hide under the stairs. When we took the boat, there were around 450 of us parked next to each other. My children lay on top of me.
A modest garden and a traditional stove, small ways to create a semblance of home in an otherwise barren landscape. But Aida says the family does not want to go back to Yemen.
We saw family members and neighbors die when we were in Yemen. We don't want to stay here. Though with nothing to do, we can't live here. We want a life like we had before.
Their 11-year-old daughter shows me a drawing she did at school, a way, her parents tell me, to cope with what she saw. The family say they'll try to continue on to Europe. Mane requires specialist health care for a heart condition, and they say they want their children to have a good education. Those who don't have the means to continue their journey face a stark choice. Conditions for the refugees are already harsh, but in the coming weeks they face soaring temperatures and sandstorms, making life here even less tolerable and the prospect of risking the journey back home more appealing. The camp is now home to over 6,000 Yemeni refugees, but new arrivals are slowing and some have begun opting to go back home.
The main needs, as expressed by the refugees, with still the limited resources. The employment opportunities or livelihood opportunities in the area are very limited. We are discouraging as much as we can the refugees to return back to their area of origin, since the security situation in Yemen is still very volatile.
With the prospect of a lasting ceasefire on the horizon, it's expected more Yemeni refugees will cross these waters once again in the hopes of a peaceful and more promising future. Clementine Logan, CCTV, Obok, Djibouti.
So let's go back to Cairo. Yasser is still with us. Yasser, many countries, including Djibouti, which has borne the burden of refugees from that conflict, will be hoping that the ceasefire will hold and give way to lasting stability. Ahead of peace talks slated for next week, is there confidence in the region that a political solution can be found to end that conflict?
Well, confidence is the last thing you can talk about in this region with all the conflicts in Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen. So will Yemen be a different story? Will it end quickly? What the government or the Saudi-led coalition want is that, first of all, the Houthis would leave all the areas that they have taken in Yemen, that they would accept the coalition government and they would disarm. Now, will the Houthis accept all these 3 conditions based on the UN Resolution 2216? This will be the main thing on the table of discussions next week. So far, they have not accepted that. And this has given, the conflict has given room for ISIL and other terrorist groups such Al-Qaeda to wreak havoc in the country. So there has to be some kind of a pressure on those 2 sides to sit and end their conflict and sit together on the negotiating table and solve the crisis, or else both sides will be losing at the end. So this will remain to be seen next week. But from we've seen other countries in the region, it's not very optimistic.
Oh, quite a grim picture there. Clem, let's come back to you. You did mention in your report some refugees are starting to turn back home. Tell us about that.
Well, there have been a few hundred returnees so far, and as you heard there, UNHCR and local authorities are trying to monitor their movements as best they can, but they say many refugees simply leave without telling anybody, slipping away in boats that are now coming over from Yemen to take people back. UNHCR, as you heard, there is not encouraging refugees to return at this point. It says conditions are still too unstable and not conducive to repatriation. But many of the refugees I spoke to said they simply can't face the prospect, the idea of living in the camp any longer, and they know that life is going to become even harder in the coming weeks with those notorious Hansin winds which will blow across the camp, raising temperatures to around 50 degrees. So those with the means will continue onwards, or try to at least, on to Europe, the US or Canada, where they say they have better opportunities and an education for their children. Those who don't may have to rely on relatives if they have any in Djibouti. Others face the grim prospect of staying in the camp, but many also simply end up on the streets here.
Clementine Logan live in Djibouti. Yasser Hakim in Cairo. Thank you both of you for joining us.